Thank you. I'd like to start off by saying thank you all for joining me here. I know for some of you in particular, it was pretty well done. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Fesler, and I will be presenting about easing away the church, how ease of life hurts the church. And I'm going to start off with a question, and that is, do you think that you are wealthy? Now, before you answer that, I want to ask you another one. Do you have options? Wise philosopher and comedian Chris Rock once said, wealth is not about having a lot of money. It's about having a lot of options. And if that's the case, then actually a lot of us are pretty wealthy. So then the question becomes, what options are we choosing? And if we're being honest with ourselves, how many of those options are for our own benefit? A study by Barron Public Affairs says that today's prosperity directly correlates with a decrease in individual contentment. That is to say, when we feel more comfortable, we often feel more discontent. But how does that even make sense? We're choosing something to make us feel more comfortable, and yet we feel worse at the end of that. And so there's a lot of reasons why you might feel that way. But one of the biggest is that if you grew up in America, it's been ingrained in you. All of us know someone or multiple people who started from nothing and worked their way up to something. It's this idea we love called the American dream. And it's this concept that allows for upward mobility, freedom, and equality for all people of all classes who have the will to succeed. It was brought along with the first colonists in America who were running from unjust reign, religious persecution, and poverty. They wrote it into their government in the conclusion of the Declaration of Independence, with the conclusion of, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet, I think it's fair to say, I don't think that's how most of us see the American dream today. The origin of the saying American dream was, The origin of the saying American dream was first coined by American historian and businessman James Tressel Adams in his 1931 book, The Epic of America. Adams' definition was not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are innately capable of, regardless of the fortuitous circumstances of birth or position. Adams' definition was more about an ideal character of society rather than for a quest for wealth. Yet today, we see far more examples of the latter. I mean, take a look around. America is clearly a place of a lot of abundance. As a matter of fact, it's a home to about a little bit more than a third of the world's millionaires. Half of Americans are considered high income on a global scale. We're well known for our natural resources, and we rank among some of the safest countries in the world. But we also know that there are downsides to plentifulness. One modern blogger observes, we have too much choice. So much so that we cycle through relationships and jobs. We interact with hundreds of people over the course of just weeks. We have too much stimulation. We eat too much. We fill our lives with goods we don't need. We anxiously open and reopen our phones. We seek greater and greater highs. That life is about how many goods, people, and experiences we can consume before we retire. But all of this creates a shallowness to our lived experience. And she's right. Convenience is one of America's biggest gods. Yet, like all false gods, it fails to lead to the promised implications of the idolized American dream. Ease of life's failure disappoints everyone in our country who's ever worked hard to be comfortable, yet who has ever found themselves uncomfortable. So, ease of life hurts the church in three main ways. It hurts our culture, it hurts our souls, and it distracts from the goals of the church body. The first one of those that I'm going to talk about is how ease of life hurts culture. And we see this particularly through merely nominal believers and wasted economic potential. So if you're anything like me, before I started writing this paper, used to think that the world saw Christians as a group of people who did a lot and helped a lot. But it turns out I was wrong. A study by Arizona Christian University found that evangelicals are not only fewer in number, but also less biblically grounded and politically active than most people believe. And so it's not a really big jump to say that we're also greatly influenced by surrounding culture. But Tony Campolo, an American Christian sociologist, optimistically asserts that cultural issues should be biblical: to care for the sick, to feed the hungry, to stand up for the oppressed. If the evangelical community became more biblical, everything would change. But we're not there yet. Another way that we see how ease of life hurts our culture is through our wasted economic potential. A study by World Economic Forum found that a third of American spending adds nothing to real wealth. As a matter of fact, our spending is directed away from needed education, safe infrastructure, and efficient manufacturing towards giving incentives only for the rich. In other words, we live in one of the wealthiest countries in the entire world, and we don't spend our money on the things we need to. We're not being responsible with our money. And of course, the Bible has something to say about this as well. God gives us blessings, and he gives them particularly to people who have experienced hardships. They know how to handle them. An example of this would be Abraham in Genesis 12. And God says to Abraham, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing." God blesses us so that we bless others. And if we don't bless others, then we are directly disobeying God's design. And that's where we find America today. The next big reason that ease of life hurts the church is because it hurts the individual soul. And we see this because the soul ultimately needs resistance, and the Bible explicitly warns against it. Now, I'm going to give you a natural example of resistance. And in 2013, some scientists from a place called Biosphere 2 conducted an experiment on growing trees. What they did is they planted some trees inside of a greenhouse, and they planted some trees outside of the greenhouse, and they wanted to compare their growth. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I kind of thought that the trees in the greenhouse would do a lot better. I was wrong, although they did do better at first. Initially, the trees in the greenhouse grew at a far more rapid rate, and the trees outside of the greenhouse grew a lot slower. But the trees in the greenhouse always died before reaching maturity, whereas trees outside survived. When scientists reviewed this and they wanted to see what the difference was, they came upon something that they called stress wood. And essentially, what stress wood is the fact that the trees outside survived because they received resistance, where the trees inside of the greenhouse did not. And the same study applies this to human flourishing, saying instead of teaching people to avoid stress, they should be encouraged to face the wind, make hard decisions, and learn to overcome and adapt. The more people are taught that, the better off they will be in the long run. Their roots will grow deeper, their skills will grow stronger, and they will become more successful. Now I'm going to give you another natural example of this, but I'm going to swing to the other side and talk about what too much abundance does. Now, if you're a homeowner, particularly in Texas, you have tried to get rid of cactus problem on your property. And let me tell you, there's a lot of strategies I've heard people use. You can mow them, put weed killer on them, you try to pull them up. I've heard of some people lighting them on fire. And none of those things will kill a cactus. The only way to kill a cactus is actually to overwater it. The only way to kill it is to give it too much. Humans are a lot like this. And ultimately, we see that not enough resistance and too much abundance can ultimately crush the human. We also see a biblical example of this. In Matthew 19:21-24, a rich young man approaches Jesus and asks to become one of his followers. And in response, Jesus says, "Oh, okay, well, but you need to leave your possessions behind and follow me." And the young man ends up walking away. And Jesus says to his disciples, "Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." So that should go to show too much abundance isn't helping your relationship with Jesus either. And once again, I'm going to go on the complete other side of things. A Stoic philosopher named Seneca once stated, "We become wiser by adversity. Prosperity destroys our appreciation of the right." Philosophers throughout history have alluded to this idea that having too easy of a life or letting your soul grow gluttonous dulls your wit, yet hardship and trial sharpens your wit. We see this from a modern author named Maxime Legacy in his work Inner Peace. And he talks about this idea that when you become monetarily wealthy, you're actually agreeing for your soul to not have the same amount of wealth. So that should say, like, even from a secular standpoint, they believe that resistance is better and abundance is too much. And finally, the big The third biggest reason that ease of life hurts the church is it distracts from the goals of the church body. We see this through declining attendance, the problem of consumerism, and the church not making the difference it should. And I'll start with declining attendance. A Pew Research survey found that of evangelical Protestants, 58% attend a service once a week, 30% attend a service twice a month or a few times a year, and 12% seldom to never attend. This is in sharp contrast to the American 50s, in which there was a revival of religion, quickly followed by the 60s, which there was a great questioning of religion that led to a decrease in participation. Thankfully, this plateaued in the 70s. But sadly, in the past 15 years, there's been a sharper decline than in any of those decades. And one thing I found in my research is that declining attendance relates much more to consumerism than I even understood. And consumerism relates a lot to ease of life. What ease of life does is it allows us to all take a collective breath. And when we do that as humans, we tend to look for things to consume, to entertain us, to have, to gain. And this problem finds itself in the church. A pastor named Kenneth Carter said of consumerism, much of the contemporary church reflects the idolatry of consumerism. Many people join the church simply because of what it has to offer them. A gospel of prosperity replaces the radical and costly good news of God's new creation, Jesus Christ. Churches become competitors vying for a greater share of the religious market. Evangelism is reduced down to a marketing strategy. So that brings us to consumerism. Nowadays, a lot of times when we're looking for a church, we're looking for something to gain. And whenever we either don't gain that thing or that thing becomes too hard to gain, we tend to leave the church. So that not only affects how often you're going to church, but it ultimately affects your relationship with Jesus. Jesus actually finds himself in a very similar situation in Matthew 4, 1-11. This is whenever he was being tempted in the wilderness, and he was tempted to turn stones to bread, to save himself, and to submit his power. And ultimately, Jesus makes the hard call, and he doesn't take the easy choice. And as Christians, we should do the same. As believers, we need to understand that following Jesus means we're going to have to do hard things, and that our lives are not always going to be easy. So, in contrast to today's church, the original Christians thrived despite hardship. Take, for example, Saint Sebastian, who was a Praetorian guard under Diocletian, who was known for being emperor during the peak of Christian persecution. Saint Sebastian was discovered converting his fellow guards, and he was sentenced to die. Initially, he was strapped to a tree and he was shot with arrows. He ended up actually surviving because a woman found him and nursed him back to health. But after he was healed, he actually went and presented himself to Diocletian again. Except this time, Diocletian clubbed him and he died almost immediately. Now, Saint Sebastian is not the only example of Christian martyrs, but the question becomes, how could such a belief thrive under such violence? And it was really Tertullian who said it best, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And if this is something we still can't really understand, a reverend named Benjamin Creamer once said, one lesson that we Christians have not learned in the last 2,000 plus years is that Jesus had no political power over the Roman Empire, excuse me. And he still changed the world. We keep trying to change the world the way the Roman Empire did, instead of the way Jesus did. In other words, Jesus changed the world through love, and we keep trying to politically progress instead. Jesus was a hated man, but a perfect man. And he died on the cross for our sins. And the fact that his first believers were willing to die to share the news of his death is the reason that his message has withstood the test of time. What I'm trying to say here is Jesus changed the world through sacrifice, and the word spread through sacrifice. And that is ultimately the biggest difference between the first Christians and the Christians today. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the other side. Some people say that ease of life actually helps the church. One way that it could help is it would provide more resources, or I guess allow more resources. And I would say this is not true because I don't think the church utilizes its resources enough. There's a lot of issues out there, but I'll take, for example, the issue of abortion. As of 2024, the average abortion costs anywhere from $23 to $564, whereas the price of birth alone, $13,393. For any of you math people out there, that means that giving birth could be 582 times more expensive than getting an abortion. And there's a lot of reasons for this cost deficit, but one of the biggest is the fact that abortion clinics are more often government subsidized, while birth clinics are often more state subsidized and often struggle for proper funding. So one way out of many that the church can step into this is helping subsidize birth clinics. Now, another reason that some people say that Ease of Life could actually help the church is through religious tolerance. Now, I need to clear up something really fast, and that is the way we understand religious tolerance today is not the way that they used to understand religious tolerance. This idea came with the first colonists who were running from religious persecution. So, of course, they wanted a land where they wouldn't be persecuted for their beliefs. And it should also be noted that all the colonists were some denomination of Christianity, but I don't have to tell you that it didn't last that way for very long. And over time, zealous religion began to decline. And during that decline, the Bill of Rights was being developed. It says of religious tolerance, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, I need you guys to hear me say, I am not saying that we should not have religious tolerance, but I am saying we need to have a better understanding of it. Because the way we understand religious tolerance today is actually a fallacy. It's called the fallacy of false compromise. And what the fallacy of false compromise is instead of focusing on the actual issue and its resolution, we distract from that. And we see this in our government all the time, actually. And an example of this would be in the civil rights movement, when the government might pass a law that allows African Americans to eat inside of a restaurant, but only at segregated tables. And it might leave people feeling that an imperfect law might be better than any law at all. But that's not true. And this becomes a really big problem when the thing being compromised is as important as something like civil rights or represented religion. What we need is for the government to stop taking something like religion and making laws that only diffuse disagreements about the religion and its truth. Ultimately, sorry guys, sorry for that, hold on. I'm gonna go on to my next reason. Another reason that we see that ease of life hurts the church is through is because it could have us have a more advanced and well-rounded understanding of Christianity in the modern world. But I don't even have to tell you guys that that's not really happening because there's a lot of problems with the church. But one of the biggest is its inability to understand and properly display the gospel. The two biggest reasons people leave the church are because of shame and judgment. A 2017 Lifeway Research survey found that a majority, 66% of Americans aged 23 to 30, left the church for at least a year after turning 18. And another study found that when people leave the church for such reasons as that, then they go out into the world and they try to find different relationships, such as friendships, social workers, therapists, etc. And when they find healthiness in those relationships, they are falsely led to believe that they can find true restoration and healing from them as well. But we all know that those things only come from Jesus, and the church should be at the forefront of explaining and understanding that truth, not berating people for it. In short, the church fails to apply the gospel, let alone teach or understand less crucial things. Overall, abundance does not help the church because it is not being properly utilized. So, this thesis demonstrates that ease of life hurts our culture, and we see that because of wasted potential, and it ultimately hurts itself. Next, ease of life hurts our souls. We see this because resilience is better, and the Bible explicitly speaks against it. And finally, ease of life hurts the church because it directly destroys and dilutes the gospel, and it leads to consumerist tendencies. So where are we left with? Well, frankly, we're left with a great need of change. And if you want to change something as big and as important as a problem in our religion, we need to look at somebody in the past who did it really well. And one of the most beloved examples of this is Martin Luther King Jr. He was a big fan of social change, but moreover, he was a fan of intentional action. So much so that he was accused of being an extremist. In response to this, he said, "We should not be ashamed of being called extremists." As a matter of fact, the most influential people in all of history were all extreme in their cause that changed the world. Moreover, he says, the question is not whether we will be an extremist, but what we choose to be extremists about. And so today, Christians are left with the same option, to either extremely change or let the church be extremely destroyed by ease of life. Thank you.